Today is Monday, 28th October, and in my last video, I said I would turn first to the situation in the Middle East and to the ongoing conflict between Iran and Israel, a conflict which of course is taking place in the context of wars which Israel continues to wage in Gaza, South Lebanon, and against the Houthis in Yemen. All of which I will say a certain amount in a moment. But anyway, I said I would turn first to the situation in the Middle East, to certain comments made by Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, and that is what I intend to do in this program. I say that notwithstanding the fact that, in my opinion, the biggest events continue to be those which are taking place in the war in Ukraine, at least the biggest events over the last 24 hours. The situation in the Middle East, however, remains dangerous and unpredictable. And I'm going to start in discussing, discussing all of that, the things that Ayatollah Khamenei, as I said, Iran's supreme leader. I believe the correct title is leader of the Islamic Revolution. Anyway, what Ayatollah Khamenei actually said. And I'm taking this now from the various Iranian news agencies. And this is what the text, essentially, it's the same text in all the various news agencies, Tasnim, Fars, the other ones. It's the same text that they all use to describe Ayatollah Khamenei's words. Leader of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei, says Iranian authorities are in charge of deciding the quality of Iran's show of power to the Israeli regime. He made the remarks during a meeting with the families of martyrs of security in Imam Khomeini Husayniya, Tehran on Sunday. I believe that is the major mosque in Tehran, just saying. Ayatollah Khamenei said the Israeli government's miscalculation should be thwarted. The Israelis need to understand the power, determination, and innovation of the Iranian nation and its youth. How to convey this power and resolve of the Iranian nation to Israel is for our officials to determine, and what is in the best interest of the nation and the country, and what should therefore be done. We then go on to read that the leader, which is to say Ayatollah Khamenei, further emphasized that Israel's act was an evil act, which, however, should neither be exaggerated nor downplayed. And he went on to say that regarding the issue of confronting Israel, a major shortcoming is on the part of governments, nations, and international organizations such as the United Nations, and then he criticized the silence of those organizations with respect to Israeli actions in Gaza and Lebanon. Now, I find these very interesting words because at one level, they are very ambiguous, and at the same time, they point, in my opinion, in a concerning direction. Now, I've been reading various commentaries and discussions about these words of Ayatollah Khamenei. I read a long article, for example, about them in the Financial Times, which show them as words that appear to signal de-escalation. And in a sense, they do. Khamenei did not come forward and say, we are going to attack Israel tomorrow. What the Israelis did was absolutely unacceptable, and we must respond immediately and in kind, and there will be another major missile strike by us against the Israelis over the next few hours. He didn't say anything like that, but, and I'm here careful to use Iran's own translations of his words. They, the Israelis, need to understand the power, determination, and innovation of the Iranian nation and its youth. How to convey this power and resolve of the Iranian nation to the Israeli government. He used stronger words. He didn't call it Israeli government. Those are my words. But anyway, I have to be careful sometimes in my choice of words, even when I'm repeating the words of someone else. How to convey this power and resolve of the Iranian nation to the Israeli government is for our officials to determine, and what is in the best interests of the nation and the country should be done. How to convey this power and resolve of the Iranian nation is for our officials to determine, and what is in the best interests of the nation and the country should be done. Now, those are extremely interesting words, because what Ayatollah Khamenei seems to be saying here is that he is not going to make the decision as to how Iran is going to respond to the action that Israel has taken. He's delegating this decision to people who he calls the officials. In other words, the technocratic, military, political, industrial element of the Iranian power structure. Now, there have been various other comments by other Iranian officials, and they are actually, when you analyze them carefully, consistent with these words of Ayatollah Khamenei's. So, for example, President Pezeshkian says that Iran is not looking for a war with Israel, but it will definitely take the steps it needs to defend itself. We do not seek war, but we will defend our country and the rights of our people. We will give a proportionate response to the aggression of the Israeli regime. And that's something he said in a meeting of the cabinet. And he went on to say, if the Israeli regime continues its aggression and tensions will escalate. And the Iranian foreign minister, who's busy contacting all sorts of officials in many places, in many different countries, he has also said that Iran won't renounce the right to respond to Israel. Iran will not renounce its right to respond to Israel. Regardless of the exchange of talks, we are resolute and serious in giving our response. Notice the word response. He's talking here about response rather than direct retaliation. And the leader of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, here I'm repeatedly using, I should stress, original Iranian translations of their words. He said that Israel's action was illegitimate and unlawful. It revealed the Israeli government's miscalculation and its frustration in the battlefield against the combatants of the Great Front of Islamic Resistance, especially in Gaza and Lebanon. But then he goes on to say, they're making a miscalculation. This is the head of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. To give him his name, General Hossein Salami. He goes on to say they're making a miscalculation with respect to Iran. Our officials should be the ones to assess and precisely apprehend what needs to be done and do whatever is in the best interests of this country and nation. They, the enemy, must be made to realize who the Iranian people are and what the Iranian youth are like. Now, these are echoes, almost exact echoes, of what Ayatollah Khamenei is saying. Our officials should be the ones to assess and precisely apprehend what needs to be done and do whatever is in the best interests of this country and nation. They, the enemy, must be made to realize who the Iranian people are and what the Iranian youth are like. Now, I have to say straight away, you can, if you choose, interpret these words as leading to de-escalation or suggesting de-escalation. I think they point in a completely different direction to a decision on the brink of being made in Iran to restart Iran's nuclear weapons program. Now, the international consensus, one not accepted by Iran, is that Iran had a nuclear weapons program until 2003. It had basically got undergoing a couple of years before, as I have discussed in program after program, extending back in the past. It was a program, a nuclear weapons program, that was not intended to respond to Israel or the United States. It was not about Israel and the United States at all. It was a nuclear weapons program that was triggered by Iran's discovery that Iran's enemy, Saddam Hussein, the president of Iraq, who had waged a brutal war against Iran in the 1980s, had an advanced nuclear weapons program of his own. And the Iranians were very concerned, unsurprisingly, about what Saddam Hussein might do with a nuclear weapon. And so they decided that they need to deter him from using his nuclear weapon, if he ever acquired it, against them by acquiring one of their own. And they obtained the necessary technology from Pakistan, and they initiated a nuclear weapons program, and that nuclear weapons program was abandoned in 2003 when, following the American invasion of Iraq, Saddam Hussein's regime fell and the nuclear program was put to sleep once and for all. In fact, we know that in practice, in reality, after the 1991 US-Iraq war, to all intents and purposes, Iraq's nuclear weapons program had come to a complete stop. Iraq in the 1990s was no longer pursuing it any further. Anyway, after 2003, with Saddam Hussein gone, Iran came to the conclusion that there was no further point in pressing forward with a nuclear weapons program, and for that reason they discontinued it. Now, in a recent program that we did with him, Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson of the United States Armed Forces, former Chief of Staff to Colin Powell, person who had numerous contacts over the course of many negotiations with the Iranian officials, he said that the Iranians do have a genuine theological and philosophical objection to nuclear weapons. But this is not so strong as to preclude the Iranians from pressing forward with a nuclear weapons program if they come to the view that they have no alternative in order to safeguard their security. And Lieutenant Colonel Wilkerson suggested that, in fact, the further Iran is pushed into a box by all of these actions that have been taken against it over the last year or so by specifically Israel and to some extent by the United States, the more likely the Iranians are eventually to move forward with a nuclear weapons program. Now, returning to the topic of those theological and philosophical objections to nuclear weapons possession that Lieutenant Colonel Wilkerson was talking about, that brings us back to that famous fatwa, or rather series of fatwas, religious edicts, promulgated by Iran's leader, supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. And these are sometimes cited by people as implying that it is a prohibited under Islamic law for Iran to possess nuclear weapons. Now, there have been several fatwas, and I don't pretend to have read every one of them. I have been told, and I'm not an authority on Islamic jurisprudence, but I've been told that in the world of Shia Islam, fatwas are not things that are impossible to reverse. So even if there was a decision that it was religiously inappropriate to possess nuclear weapons, I suspect that circumstances could be found whereby that prohibition might be relaxed. But anyway, the one fatwa of Khamenei's that I have read, which is the one that is most often quoted, the fatwa that is most often quoted, and of course I'm reading it in English, not in Iranian or Arabic, languages which I do not understand. Anyway, the text of the fatwa that I have read does not anyway seem to me to prohibit possession of nuclear weapons. Rather, it appears to prohibit use of nuclear weapons. So it looks to me as if what Khamenei was saying is that it is obviously prohibited in theological terms to use nuclear weapons, but to possess them in order to acquire a deterrent capability, well, that might fall short of that. So I think there might already be more flexibility in the wording of the fatwas or fatwa than perhaps people understand. But let's go back to what Khamenei has just said, because he is, of course, the leader of the revolution, but he's an Islamic scholar. But he is now saying that the Israelis need to be made to understand the power, determination, and innovation of the Iranian nation. How to convey this power and resolve is for our officials to determine, and what is in the best interest of the nation should be done. And the head of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, General Salami, has said the same. Our officials should be the ones to assess and precisely apprehend what needs to be done and whatever is in the best interests of the country. So, What Khamenei is saying is, look, I have these theological and philosophical concerns. You know about them. I'm not actually, in my specifically prohibited possession of nuclear weapons, use of them I have spoken about, but possession is something else. The Israelis have been constantly attacking our country. They've been more and more aggressive over the last year. They seem to be aiming for an all-out war with us. And what we need to do is to impress upon them the extent of our power and of our capacity for innovation. And doesn't that basically signal resuming a nuclear weapons program, moving forward and acquiring within a fairly circumscribed period of time a nuclear weapons capability in order to impress on the Israelis the extent of Iran's power and its resolve, words that Khamenei has used, and its capacity for innovation. Because try as Iran has, through launching one missile strike and then another missile strike, the Israelis don't seem to be getting the message. Now, that is my interpretation of what all this is about. I mean, I understand that it is my interpretation and that others will disagree. But I would suggest that when parsed carefully, when examined carefully, this is the most natural meaning, both of Khamenei's words and of the words of the other Iranian officials. They understand, or they have decided, that Israel is seeking war, and they've decided that the only way that they can deter that is by acquiring a nuclear weapons capability. And in that very subtle and careful way that the Iranians can sometimes do, in a way that doesn't broadcast the intention to go for nuclear weapons, to seek to acquire nuclear weapons to the world, Ayatollah Khamenei is now, in effect, giving the green light for the resumption of the nuclear weapons program. Now, of course, it may not be quite that simple. The IAEA has its people in Iran. There are all sorts of cameras in all sorts of places and facilities. Iran does have a nuclear stockpile. It does have centrifuges, all of those sort of things. But up to now, they've been closely monitored. We will see whether over the next few weeks or months, decisions are made in Iran to cut back on all of that monitoring and all of that investigation and surveillance by the IAEA. If so, then we will be, I think, sure that the Iranians, that Ayatollah Khamenei, over the last couple of days, no doubt after deep discussions with Iranian officials, and notice his careful use of the word officials, which of course encompasses the army, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and the government, that after in-depth discussions with all of these people, that he has indeed relaxed his previous prohibition and given to the resumption of the nuclear weapons program the green light. Now, at that point, just to say, it's likely that we're going to see tensions soar. The Israelis have been talking about Iran acquiring nuclear weapons for decades. They've been making our flesh creep with fears that such a thing was round the corner. They have repeatedly said that this would be an existential danger to themselves. If they now come to the same conclusions that I am, that more likely than not, the Iranians have now made that decision, then plausibly the Israelis are going to do something even more dramatic and dangerous and reckless and ill-conceived than what they have done already. And given the language that the Israelis have used, language which, by the way, I suspect many of them sincerely believe, I fear that there is literally no limit, that they will stop before in order to prevent this danger of Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon. And of course, if the Middle East, the countries of the Middle East, start to apprehend that Iran is indeed moving towards acquiring a nuclear weapons capability, then the process of nuclear proliferation across the Middle East will begin with a vengeance. I think it is inconceivable that Saudi Arabia will allow Iran to become the one country in the Middle East other than Israel to possess nuclear weapons. There are rumors, which I am sure are well founded and true, that Saudi Arabia has a long-standing agreement with Pakistan, that Pakistan will provide Saudi Arabia immediately with a stockpile of nuclear weapons if Iran acquires its own. And I personally would not be surprised if other Arab states start to follow suit. Egypt is an obvious possibility. I have no doubt that they have the technological abilities to develop nuclear weapons, though, of course, it would take them a very long time to get a nuclear weapons program up and running, so that would be years and years away. But the resources, the intellectual resources and the scientific resources to do it in Egypt undoubtedly are there. And of course, it's not perhaps entirely a coincidence that Egypt is also racing ahead to develop a nuclear weapons capability, or rather a nuclear power capability, and it is doing so, by the way, in collaboration with the Russians. Another country which is likely to be further advanced, in fact, significantly further advanced in developing nuclear weapons capability, and which will undoubtedly, or I'm confident, will be spurred to move forward in that direction if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, will be Turkey. Just to say. Now, if all of these countries, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, of course, do acquire nuclear weapons, we are looking at a completely different Middle East. And the stakes in the Middle East game, this terrifyingly dangerous and complicated game that has been played out in the Middle East over the last year, will go spiraling far, far higher. And I have to say this, the scope for action, the maneuver space of the United States will be severely restricted. So I don't think this is in the interests of the United States. I hope that there are analysts in the United States who are studying Ayatollah Khamenei's words as carefully as I am doing. Maybe they are, and maybe they're coming to diametrically opposite conclusions from mine. I accept that, this is my interpretation of his words, and they should not be taken in any sense as authoritative. No doubt There are people in the United States and the intelligence community there with immeasurably better information about the true state of things in Iran. And of course, they speak Farsi and Arabic, which I don't, so they can judge more carefully the nuances in the words that Khamenei and the other Iranian officials are using. But if I am right, then I would suggest that those analysts and students of these matters within the US intelligence community should alert their political masters urgently about how dangerous the slide in the Middle East is becoming. We are not only on the potential brink of a major war in the Middle East, and as I discussed in my program of a couple of days ago, a vitally important threshold has already been crossed, with both the Iranians and the Israelis now conducting major, serious strikes, attacks upon the territory of the other. So not only is the situation dangerous already to an extreme degree, but if the judgment is that Ayatollah Khamenei's words mean what I take them to mean, then I think the political leadership, both the current political leadership in the United States and the one that takes over in January, need to be alerted right away that it could become far more dangerous very soon, and that the time window before things start to get really serious is probably very small. So there we are. That is my analysis of the words of Ayatollah Khamenei. I'll be very interested to see what people in the thread to this video think, and obviously I'll be keeping an eye out to see what other people in independent media think also. But if they do want to disagree and push back on my thoughts, they're entirely free to do so. But I would advise them, again, not to place over-reliance on a fatwa that, as far as I could see, was more ambiguous in its wording than perhaps they understand, and which, anyway, apparently, within the world of Islamic jurisprudence, or Shia Islamic jurisprudence, is capable of being reversed. Just saying. Now, before I press on and return to the enormous topic of the conflict in Ukraine, let me also say that the wars in Gaza and in Lebanon, and of course against the Houthis, continue, and all of this is happening as a result of those wars. Now, I'm very well aware that the careful language that I use about these wars that are being waged in Gaza and Lebanon is deeply frustrating to many people. It is frustrating to me as well. But I have to be careful, as everyone knows, of what I say. And, well, you can find many examples of what happens to people who are not so careful. So I don't think I need to explain it. Anyway, the point is, these wars are terrible. They are humanitarian catastrophes on an unimaginable and horrifying scale. They are a massive moral blemish, not just on those who are perpetrating these wars, I'm being particularly careful here, but also on the governments of the allied countries who are allowing these wars to take place. They have already dealt a colossal reputational and geopolitical cost. The reason why so many countries are trooping up and going to conferences like the BRICS conference, well, they're it's not difficult to understand why the global south, looking at the wars, these wars in the Middle East, has come to feel that the West, when it talks about values and human rights and aggression, speaks with a forked tongue and double standards, just say, in the light of what is happening. But in the context of the main topic of my program today, what I have been discussing up to this point, the fact that we could be on the brink of the reactivation of the long dormant Iranian nuclear program, a program that has been dormant, it's been kept ticking along, but it's not been allowed to progress or develop beyond a certain point since 2003. The reason we are in this position now is because, contrary to all strategic and moral sense, those wars are being persisted with. They're being persisted with in Gaza, they are being persisted with in Lebanon. The violence that is a product of the wars is also obviously very evident in the West Bank. In fact, it is escalating there all the time. And of course, I do not forget that there are thousands of people in northern Israel who have been driven from their homes. The point is that none of these wars are coming to any point of end. They all give the impression of being essentially, well, maybe not forever wars, but wars of long duration. And the longer these wars go on, and the more unstable and precarious the situation of Israel itself and of the rest of the Middle East becomes, the more reckless the various moves that are made become as well. And it is this which has led us inexorably to this situation where since April there have been a series of Israeli attacks on high-value Iranian targets, the embassy building in Damascus, the assassination of Haniyeh in Tehran, the attacks on conferences involving Hezbollah in Beirut, all of which have brought the situation between Iran and Israel to crisis, and which could be leading the Iranians to make the decisions that I think they either have made or are about to make to reactivate their nuclear weapons program. Given which, the priority must be, or should be, to anybody who wants to see not just a stable Middle East, but to avoid the ultimate catastrophe of a nuclear conflict in the Middle East, which, to be clear, very much has the ability to expand or beyond the Middle East as well. In order to avoid that catastrophe, the priority must be to achieve peace in all of these various conflicts. The decision whether there is going to be peace in Gaza and peace in Lebanon obviously is in part going to be made in Israel. After all, it is Israel that is one of the key players. It also has to be made in Gaza by Hamas and in Lebanon by Hezbollah, but Hamas and Hezbollah have repeatedly said that they are prepared to agree to a ceasefire. In fact, they have just repeated that statement all over again. And I have made the point many times that for both of these movements, Hamas and Hezbollah, a ceasefire anyway is in their interest if it also preserves their existence. So, there are the parties in the Middle East, but the crucial decision must be made, will have to be made, in the one country that continues to possess the key leverage, which is, of course, the United States. Up to now, the current administration in Washington, ever since it took that disastrous decision on the 7th of October 2023, and in the weeks after, to give Prime Minister Netanyahu what was in effect a blank check, have been unable to stop that check, even as Prime Minister Netanyahu constantly cashes it. The time has come, and it is becoming vitally important for that check to be stopped, for the Israelis to be told the situation is now becoming so dangerous for us, and by the way, also for you, that there must be peace in Gaza and South Lebanon now. And it's no longer a case of negotiating or renegotiating details or something like that. There must be full implementation of the Security Council resolutions that call for a ceasefire, and that must be done without delay, and that failure to do so will invite the strong public opposition of the United States, which will then take action through the Security Council to ensure that those Security Council resolutions calling for ceasefires are immediately enforced. I understand the political difficulties that exist in the United States, but to repeat again, if my assessment is correct, we are now entering the most dangerous point of this crisis of all, and it is time that those difficult decisions were finally taken, and perhaps that a clean breast, a frank admission of the actual realities of the situation in the Middle East were made for the first time. Anyway, those are my views. As I said, no one is under any obligation to agree with my interpretation of Ayatollah Khamenei's words, but I have set it out here, and I've explained why I hold to it. I'll be interested, as I said, to see what others say, and I will be even more interested to see what happens from this point on. Anyway, let's now move back to the situation in Ukraine. And I discussed yesterday how the last couple of hours have been completely disastrous for the Ukrainian military, and this is now becoming universally acknowledged, even within Ukraine itself. Now, over the last couple of hours, since I made my last program, Ukrainian channels have also admitted that Selidovo and Vishnevo, the village to the immediate west of Selidovo have fallen entirely under Russian control. This is no longer disputed. It seems that there is no doubt about this. And in fact, we have lots of film of Russian troops moving through Selidovo. There's dramatic pictures. Well, no, it's dramatic pictures. That's an overstatement. But we have pictures of the Russian military pulling down the Ukrainian flag from the rather impressive Soviet-era building, which houses the local council in Selidovo, the regional council, and raising the Russian flag in its place. There's pictures of movements of motorized troops, Russian troops, through Selidovo. It looks to me as if they are fully in control of the town, and there doesn't seem to be any resistance to speak of there. And as I said, Ukrainian sources are also in effect confirming that the Russians are now in full control of Selidovo and, by the way, of Vishnevo as well. And Ukrainian sources also confirm that Girnik, or Gornyak, as I will now call it, has indeed also fallen completely under Russian control. There doesn't seem to be any doubt about that either any longer. I say that I haven't actually seen any pictures or film from Girnik itself, but I've no reason to doubt that this is true. In fact, all of the reports in this area of the villages speak of the Russians intensifying their assaults on the remaining villages in this area, which still remain to some extent at least under Ukrainian control, villages like Vovchenka and Ilinka and others, and Kurakhovka. So apparently fighting now underway in Kurakhovka itself. And just shortly before I started making this program, the Russian Defense Ministry confirmed that the village of Tsukurinye, slightly to the north of this territory, south of Selidovo, that anyway, the village of Tsukurinye is under Russian control as well. There are reports that a brigade and a half of Ukrainian troops, perhaps 4,000 men, 3,000 to 4,000 men, is trapped in this area south of Girnik, in Kurakhovka and Vovchenka. The Russians have published pictures of their air force bombing the Ukrainian troops in this area. There is actually what I found rather eerie, I suspect frightening film, showing exhausted Ukrainian soldiers walking in daylight across open fields, apparently fleeing from Izmailovka, which is one of the villages that has been captured. It's unclear in what direction they're going, but they're there, they're easily visible and obviously being carefully tracked by a Russian drone. There's no film which shows the attack on these men, but it's plausible that it comes and that whoever decided to release that film, presumably the Russian Defense Ministry, decided that that particular film, that particular part of the film, should be edited out, presumably because it is just too upsetting and harrowing. But the whole effect, the whole thing looks, frankly, like a collapse and a demoralized and total one. And even as the Russians are now wrapping up their control of the four villages and have consolidated control of Selidovo and Vishnevo, we also get more news basically confirming all the information that I passed on in my program from yesterday. First of all, it is now, I think, conclusively acknowledged that the Russians do indeed control Bogoyavlenka. There are still apparently some Ukrainian troops fighting on in Shakhtarska, further to the west, but the likelihood is that village will fall as well, probably today. And again, just before I started making this program, there was confirmation, or at least there were further claims, and I believe these come from Ukrainian sources, that the Ukrainians have abandoned the village of Ukrainka that lies between these two villages, Bogoyavlenka and Shakhtarska. So, a horrible disaster, and in the meantime, on the southern fronts, and in the meantime, more reports still of the Russians now pushing westwards from Katerinovka. There were some claims that the Russians have now entered the next village west of Katerinovka. This is the village of Yelizavetivka. As I said, when one looks at a map, it becomes immediately clear that what the Russians are doing is that their group of forces, I believe it's group of forces east in the south, is converging with group of forces center, General Medvedev's troops, around Kurachovo, and that the battle for Kurachovo is about to begin, even as the battle for Selidovo has ended. And it's important to say that with Selidovo now having fallen, the Russians can also advance westwards. They can cut off other main roads from Pokrovsk. There's a road that passes from Pokrovsk west, some distance west from Selidovo, through villages like Shevchenko and Novotroitska. Anyway, gradually, systematically, the Russians look like they're taking apart this whole defense area. And to repeat again, this is the key battle of the Ukraine war, the war that we have seen being fought out, the war which the special military operation ultimately is all about. Who wins this battle is going to get very close to winning this war, and realistically, it's the Russians who are going to win this battle, and that, of course, conclusively means that the Russians, before long, are going to win this war. In the meantime, even as all of this goes on in this particular battle area, even as the Russians now pick up the pieces from their victory, even as reports circulate that there are discussions in Ukraine about abandoning Kurachovo, recognition that with all of these other locations lost, with Marinka and Vugleda and Avdiivka all lost, with the Russians closing in, with Selidovo and Novoukrainka and Ukrainsk and Gornyak now also having fallen, that holding out in Kurachovo is hopeless. Well, there are already reports, as I said, that the Ukrainians understand that the point has now come when Kurachovo itself must be abandoned, because it would be a disastrous sacrifice of the Ukrainian troops there if the Ukrainians decided to make a fight of it. For the record, by the way, I think that the authorities in Kiev will not take this wise and obvious step. It's not as if at any point in the war they have ever acted in that kind of way. But anyway, This particular big battle is now, as I said, its trajectory is clear, and the news that I discussed yesterday about the Russian breakthrough, the Russian victories, has all been confirmed. And what the Russians are now doing is that they're basically scooping up their winnings. But to repeat again, the situation elsewhere also continues to be very, very bad. Now, there's been a lot of discussion once again about the situation in Toretsk. There are claims in many of the Telegram channels and the reporting channels that the Ukrainians either fully controlled the district of Zabalka or have recaptured it from the Russians. That may or may not be true. I remember, however, that Putin apparently told his favorite journalist, Pavel Zarubin, that the Russians are blocking Ukrainian troops inside Toretsk. There are reports that the Russians have now reached a village called Sherbinivka, which is located immediately to the west of Toretsk, that they're advancing, in other words, up the railways. If they do capture Sherbinivka, then they are coming certainly within striking distance of the main road, the TO 516 road, that the Ukrainians use to supply their forces in Toretsk, the road that leads north to Konstantinovka and Kramatorsk. And as I've discussed already, that particular road looks as if it's already been patrolled by the Russian drones. It could be, and this is just a guess now, that with all of these dramatic the events taking place, and with the Russians focusing, or so it seems, most recently on capturing Chasiv Yar, that the Russians might even have pulled back some troops from Toretsk, which explains why the offensive in this town has slowed down. But, I don't pretend I actually know. But one way or the other, the situation in Donetsk may not be quite as bad as I thought it was last week, but overall, for the Ukrainians, it is still deteriorating. And in Chasiv Yar, Redovka, yesterday, Russian newspaper based in Smolensk, heavily focused, committed to sort of patriotic, nationalist positions. It is saying that because of the Russian breakthroughs in the south and center of Toretsk, that the Ukrainians have now evacuated two of the main micro-districts, the Novi micro-district, and I believe the other one is the Oktyabr micro-district of Chasiv Yar, which would imply that the Russians must now control, or must be on the brink of gaining control of, well, maybe half of Chasiv Yar, possibly even more. Just saying. So that's from Redovka. Redovka is not infallible. Sometimes they make mistakes. But generally, I have tended to find them reliable. So even though, as I said, the major catastrophe has taken place in southwest Donbas, in Chasiv Yar, in Toretsk, well, there might be ebbs and flows, but overall the current is flowing strongly in the Russians' favor, as it is in Siversk, and as it is in these very complicated battles on the Oskol and Zherebets river lines, where there are also reports today that the Russians have captured the eastern part of the important village of Torske, located a short distance east of Liman. Liman, of course, being on the other side of the Zherebets River, and where apparently the Russians also look to be working towards a potential attack on Kupiansk, maybe from the Sinkovka area, where the Russians now apparently close to clearing the villages Kruglyakivka, Boguslavka, Stelmachovka, Glushkovka, also on the Oskol River, immediately to the south of Kupiansk. Anyway, so the current in all of these places is very much in the Russian direction. And I was reading again about how the Russians group of forces north continues to talk about its advances in Kursk region. They're now saying that they're 4 kilometers from Suja. That doesn't mean that they're on the brink of attacking Suja. I'm not sure where they are positioned, which brings them 4 kilometers from Suja. But it does look as if the Kursk pocket is contracting. The Russians are full of confidence. And we have a reflection of this in what an official of the Donetsk regional government, that is to say, the Russian-backed Donetsk regional government, Igor Kimakovsky, said on a live broadcast to Solovyov live television earlier today. He said, "I know one thing. The Donetsk People's Republic will be liberated, and I believe that several months are left before this event. I know this for sure, and I see it and feel it along the front line. Today, the country is changing, and this will have its effect on the line of engagement very soon." And Kimakovsky is then reported, I'm taking all this from TASS, by the way, that after Russian troops liberated the settlement of Ugleda, the Ukrainian army's defense south of Pokrovsk is collapsing. Dry weather has facilitated the advance of the Russian forces. The Ukrainian army, are engaged in point defense and actually have no reserves. This is what Kimakovsky is saying. So he is talking about the liberation of Donbass being now just a matter of months. And his words are echoed by German intelligence, by an assessment by German intelligence, apparently, and by comments made by Julian Röpke, the the Ukraine correspondent of the German tabloid Bild Zeitung. Röpke is apparently saying that the Russians expect to have the whole of Donbass under their control by the end of this year, and that their objective is to reach the Dnieper. And apparently German intelligence is saying that the Russian objective is to gain control of all of Ukraine east of the Dnieper, including Kharkiv, by some point in 2025, reducing Ukraine, what's left of Ukraine, to a purely agricultural country, one stripped of all its mineral wealth, its industrialized, its engineering bases, Kharkiv, Zaporozhye, Dnipro, and I presume also, by the way, other places as well. German intelligence apparently doubts that the Russians are going to cross the Dnieper and thinks that a Russian advance on Kherson and Odessa is unlikely. I think that might be a complacent view. And I think that, and they apparently think that Putin, and of course it's always Putin, not the Russian government altogether, but Putin supposedly is looking forward for all of this to happen and for the war to be done and dusted and won by some point in 2026. And Röpke, for his part, is saying that the Russians are maneuvering towards negotiations, but the negotiations will not be sincere. They're basically intended to mislead everybody and to pull the Ukrainians along, even and the world along, into thinking that the Russians want a peaceful settlement and that this will happen this will provide cover for these Russian advances that both he and German military intelligence anticipate. Now, all of this may be right, except that I will say one thing. Röpke appears to believe that the Russians are going to have complete control of Donbass, including presumably places like Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka, before the end of this year. Now, that seems to me a tall order, given that the end of the year is perhaps 10 weeks away. I find it very, very difficult to believe that in just 10 weeks, the Russians are going to be able to capture big places like Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, and Konstantinovka, let alone Pakrovsk and Kurachovo. That even if one allows that the Russians probably will by year end have a military even bigger than the one they have now, a military numbering perhaps, well, the Ukrainians say 840,000 men. I still think it very tough to imagine that they can just capture all of these big places in just 10 weeks, all at the same time. And I think on that issue, Röpke is being either alarmist from a Ukrainian point of view or overconfident from a Russian. I think that realistically, this war is going to continue at least into 2025. It will take the Russians a couple more weeks and months. Well, of course, Kimakovsky is talking about months before Donbass itself is cleared. Meanwhile, we have rumors that Putin is again talking to his foreign ministry officials about presenting a ultimatum, presumably to the Ukrainians and to the Western powers, once Donbass has passed fully under Russian control. And I'm going to make a guess that the ultimatum is one which requires the Ukrainians to withdraw completely from the 4 regions, with the warning that if they don't, then the Russian advance will continue until all of the objectives of the special military operation are achieved, but offering negotiations and a possible ceasefire if the Ukrainians accept the loss of the 4 regions and indicate their willingness to accept the various other provisions of Istanbul Plus. So I think this is probably what the point we are now heading at. The key thing to understand, however, is whether or not the Russians are indeed intent on fooling the world about negotiations. The problem with negotiations continues to be the West, to a very great extent. I've already discussed how no party in the West seems to have the courage or the political will to talk about the need for negotiations, so that it's all reduced to parties like Viktor Orban in Hungary and others like that to talk about these things. But the other major problem is the Ukrainians themselves. Now, yesterday, as the news, the bad news, cascaded into Kiev, the Ukrainians did begin to signal what they perhaps see as shifts, though, as we will see, they are shifts to nowhere. So firstly, Zelensky's chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, the man who many people believe is the real power behind the throne in Kiev, Zelensky's éminence grise, as some would say. Anyway, Yermak gave an interview in which he said, yes, of course, there can be a ceasefire, there can be talks, but the talks must be about the eventual return to Ukraine of all the territory that Ukraine controlled before 2014. In other words, a return to the 1991 borders. And in order for there to be a ceasefire, the Russians must first withdraw all the way back to the lines that they had in February 2022 before the special military operation was launched. That was Yermak. That was his apparent concession. He's agreeing, finally, that there can be a ceasefire without the Russians withdrawing from every millimeter of territory that Ukraine possessed before 2014. But he's now talking about the Russians withdrawing to the lines of February 2022. This is an absurd fantasy. If the Ukrainians had proposed that in the autumn of 2022, after Ukraine's successful Kharkov and Kherson offensives, I should say, when I say successful, I always mean that. I always put that in quotation marks because, in my opinion, those offensives probably weakened Ukraine more than they strengthened it. But anyway, I'm not going to go down that discussion now. But anyway, if the Ukrainians had proposed that then, well, it might have been the case that the Russians would have agreed to talks on that basis. But who can honestly think that the Russians would agree to anything like that now, in the current conditions, when everybody can see, everybody acknowledges that they're winning the war, and when Putin has already made it clear that as far as he is concerned, as far as the Russians are concerned, the entire territory of the four regions, including, by the way, Kherson region west of the Dnieper, is non-negotiable and must be accepted as Russian. I mean, it is a fantasy for Yermak to talk in this fashion. But Zelensky is doing no better. So he gave an interview yesterday in which he said that, yes, he's prepared to move forward to a peace plan, and he would be willing to incorporate ideas from the Brazilian and Chinese peace proposals into his peace conference he wants to hold, provided, however, that the Brazilian and Chinese proposals complement and eventually arrive at the same outcome as his own peace plan, which is the return to Ukraine of all of the territory that it possessed before 2014. Now, Zelensky probably will see that as a shift on his part. He's no longer being unbelievably rude about the Brazilians and the Chinese as he was being just 2 weeks ago. But again, what he is proposing is absurd. The Brazilian and Chinese proposals are not there to complement. He's completely unrealistic, indeed frankly fantastic peace plan, which, as I've said many times, isn't really a peace plan at all. They were as intended as realistic alternatives to that peace plan. Zelensky coming up with these ideas is again going to convince the Brazilians and the Chinese that he is not operating in the real world. And Zelensky is up to it again today. He's just given an interview to the Times of India in which he says things like this. Prime Minister Modi is the Prime Minister of a really huge country. True. India is a big country. Rather an obvious statement, some of us might have thought. But anyway, there we go. Modi is the Prime Minister of a really huge country. Such a country cannot just say we are interested in the end of the war. Prime Minister Modi can influence the end of the Ukrainian war. Undoubtedly, talks can be held in India, and Prime Minister Modi can really do that. But I think we need to prepare ourselves, and only according to our format, that is to say his peace plan, because the war is in our land. We have the platform, which is the Peace Summit. So he's saying, of course, by all means, Prime Minister Modi, leader of a great country, he can host the peace conference, but the objective of the peace conference, the end destination point of the peace conference must be, can only be, the return to Ukraine of all its territory, all of the territory it had when it gained independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, and nothing else will do. And again, just as the Brazilians and the Chinese must be shaking their head and saying to themselves, is this man for real? The Indians will, of course, be doing the same. Now, some may welcome these comments by Yermak and Zelensky himself as signaling at least some return to reality. My own view is that they are manifestations of the panic and despair that must exist in Kiev as they sense that the entire situation on the battlefronts is now heading remorselessly towards collapse, and as they sense that support from the West is falling away. But they're trying to maneuver, they're trying to create conditions basically to stop the ongoing Russian offensive, which they understand they cannot stop. But they're not putting forward any proposal that the Russians will ever accept and will ever work with, because ultimately, psychologically, they can't. So there it is. Unless the West takes over and puts the pressure on the Ukrainians and tells the Ukrainians, you must talk, unless the Americans do what I suggested some of them might finally be thinking of doing, which is telling the Ukrainians, look, if you don't talk, you're on your own, because we in the United States have more important and concerning things, more important for us and more pressing things for us. And we've done all that we can for you. Well, unless the Western powers are honest with the Ukrainians in that kind of way, then I'm afraid I think that we're going to continue to get these complicated proposals from Zelensky and Yermak, which when you subject them to even the most casual scrutiny, you discover almost immediately that they really don't amount to anything. Now, Lavrov has also had, the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov has also had an interview with Zarubin. Zarubin has obviously been interviewed by a lot of people recently. And Lavrov has discussed a conversation that Putin and Xi Jinping had with each other about the situation in the conflict with Ukraine in the Kazan BRICS summit. And according to TASS, this is what Lavrov said to Zarubin. Well-known facts were mentioned, this is between Putin and Xi, when Zelensky himself rejected talks. As President Putin has confirmed, we are ready for talks. And our president confirmed that we appreciate the wish of China, Brazil, and other of our strategic partners from the global south to find ways for a peaceful settlement of the conflict. The trouble is that whenever proposals for talks happen, and this is apparently something that Xi Jinping and Putin agreed with each other about in Kazan, this is according to Lavrov, whenever the topic of serious talks comes up, the Ukrainians basically disappear. Putin made the same point himself when discussing the proposals that Erdogan brought with him to Kazan for negotiations about a new grain deal and cessation of attacks on nuclear power plants and things of that kind. Putin said, yes, we're prepared to look at it, we're prepared to sit down and have discussions, except whenever that happens, the Ukrainians immediately melt away. And I'm afraid we're going to have this continue right up to the moment when the Russians reach the Dnieper and cross the Dnieper and then perhaps battle on towards Kiev and who knows, perhaps other places. German intelligence now talks about the Russians approaching that point where they will not only win the war, but reduce Ukraine to an exclusively agrarian society. Well, I can think of worse outcomes for Ukraine from this war than that. I think it's high time that this was well understood across the West, well understood across Ukraine itself. And as I said, the telephones to Moscow need to start ringing. Time is now short. If the Russians do reach the Dnieper, if they do start to cross the Dnieper, well, by then, of course, it will be too late. Anyway, this is where I end my program today. Tomorrow, I'll be discussing the situation in Georgia, where there's, of course, been the parliamentary elections, which, as many predicted, the Georgian Dream Party has won. And as everyone, lots of other people also predicted, the opposition has refused to accept the results, and nor have Western governments, and where it's possible, though perhaps not certain, that we will get a political crisis over the next couple of weeks. But anyway, that's for tomorrow. In the meantime, as I said, this is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribe Star, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you'll find all the amazing things that we have, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.